The life of us women was really a pitiful one. All France seemed to be in Russia. Our desires, our fears, our prayers, all were directed there. The nation had never been so widely separated from its defenders. The distance at which war was being waged increased its terrors. There were many complaints against the man who had carried it so far afield. He should have forgiven them. Sorrow is a bad counselor by which to judge of vast projects. As yet, it only began to make itself heard, but the situation grew more serious the day when fortune, weary of being always on our side, seemed suddenly to desert us, chose to set at naught both our skill and our courage, and even raise the elemental forces of nature to combat our armies. How completely our grandeur was overthrown! How our pride was humbled! On that day, the Northern Empire, which had apparently retreated in confusion, turned on us. Only a few broken, scattered fragments of France's great host came back, broken men, but heroes all. Our distress, our grief was as overwhelming as the disasters that had caused it. Everything was swathed in mourning. Equally dismayed and surprised at having met with defeat the French nation, which so long had allowed itself blindly to obey one man's commands, now arose and seemed ready to play a part in shaping its own destiny. As for that man, whose heart was broken, but whose genius was necessary to limit and combat the effects of the general disaster, he arrived in Paris almost as soon as the news of what had happened. His sudden appearance, his firm attitude kept people in order. No more criticism was heard. Our humiliation was too great to express itself in complaints, and national pride forbade counting the cost of new sacrifices. As soon as I heard of the Emperor's return, I went to the Tuileries. He seemed to be wearied, worried, but not disheartened. I had often seen him lose his temper about some trifle, such as a door open when it should have been shut, or vice versa, a room too brightly or too dimly lighted. But in times of difficulty or misfortune, he was completely master of his nerves. I inquired anxiously whether the disasters which had befallen the army had been as serious as his reports had stated. He replied with a tone of repressed emotion. I told the entire truth. But, I exclaimed, we were not the only ones to suffer. Our enemies must also have suffered very severe losses. That is certainly true, he answered, but it does not console me. I asked for news of my brother, and he replied in a rather distant manner. I easily guessed the reason for this attitude. During the campaign, the Duc de Rovigo had lacked details of what was going on at the front. Paris was becoming uneasy. He heard that my brother's secretary had sent word to his family by a dispatch bearer who had just arrived from Russia, and he wished to know what news those letters contained. He hastened to make inquiries. The letter that was shown him contained much praise of my brother's conduct. It mentioned, among other things, that his army corps had been the only one that offered any resistance at Miloyaretsovets, where it had met with considerable success. The emperor had warmly praised the attitude of these troops. The Duc de Rovigo had orders to have an account of this action printed in full in the newspapers in order to reassure the Parisians. My mother, in reading how gallantly her son had behaved, had been much pleased, but I could not understand why the article did not appear in the official account of the battle, especially as the following day the bulletin described the advantages won by my brother's army corps without mentioning his name. The Duc de Rovigo was likewise struck by this difference between the two accounts of the same battle. Fearing that he would be accused of having himself been the author of these flattering remarks, he wrote the emperor that it was my brother's secretary who was responsible for their appearing in print. I heard from Monsieur de Lavalette that the emperor was extremely vexed at what he considered a little trick on our part. Indeed, he was so annoyed that sometime later, speaking to it of Marshal Marmont, he said, I gave everyone his just deserts in the way of praise, in spite of the compliments some people had printed about themselves in the newspapers. The Duc de Vincennes, Caulaincourt, who alone had accompanied the emperor from Vilnius to Paris, came to see me the day after his arrival. I spoke to him about my brother and how worried I was to have the latter serving under the King of Naples, Murat. He gave me many details of the misfortunes which had befallen our forces and told me how greatly Eugene and Marshal Ney had distinguished themselves, especially by their presence of mind at a time when everybody was distraught. But, he added, I earnestly advise you to talk only about what Marshal Ney did and not mention your brother. He said nothing more on the subject. My sister-in-law, in a letter to the emperor, also expressed her anxiety because her husband was serving under the king of Naples, Murat. The emperor, speaking to me about this letter, said, "These young wives, if people paid any attention to them, would ruin their husbands." I did not doubt, in view of all these incidents, that the emperor, believing some false report, distrusted the loyalty and attachment of Eugene and judged him in a way that was unworthy of both their characters. Ideas which I was powerless to efface at once, although I was well aware that they would not last long. So it turned out. For when Murat suddenly abandoned the army to return to Naples, and when the discouragement of the troops had reached its height, the emperor turned to Eugene. The latter, by his tireless activity, managed to gather together these scattered remnants of the various units and form these wounded, badly equipped, into spirited men into an army which could still hold in check both the enemies which were pursuing them and the others which rose about them on every side. Never had a general found himself in as critical and difficult a situation. Eugene devoted himself to his task without any thought of fame or honors, but animated solely by a desire to do his duty. The emperor was forced to recognize the fact that he was deeply indebted to my brother, but he never admitted it. We were all of us anxious to obtain full details as to what happened in Russia, and we felt both sorrowful and proud on hearing these tales of disaster and heroism. I enjoyed anecdotes about incidents proving the nobility of human nature and was deaf to those which displayed it in an unfavorable light. I never wearied of hearing about those episodes which increased my admiration for the soldiers of France. For instance, there was the case of a young man named Burgoyne, who, at the risk of his own life, had refused to abandon his brother, who was ill, and by his persistent courage had conquered the terrible assaults both of the climate and of the enemy. Monsieur de Brac and Monsieur de Cubier had undertaken to save a poor woman and her child. Scarcely had they secured a horse and a sleigh when the horse died, and they found themselves surrounded by Cossacks and obliged to continue to defend themselves in spite of their exhausted condition. My brother, thanks to his presence of mind, performed a skillful maneuver and succeeded by taking advantage of the darkness in silently extricating his entire force from the hostile troops, who had completely surrounded him, thus frustrating them of their prey. Marshal Ney attempted the same feat, but he was less fortunate. He lost his way in the snowstorm. My brother, when he rejoined the emperor, heard that the marshal's troops had probably either perished or been taken prisoners. The emperor was inconsolable. "I would have given all the wealth I possessed to have avoided such a misfortune," he exclaimed. My brother and his soldiers undertook to save the situation. Although they had just escaped from those dangers and were in the greatest need of rest, they set out. My brother led the way in the direction in which he supposed the marshal to be. Never was there a more touching scene than when the two armies met. Never was the sight of the imperial eagles under which they had both fought received with more enthusiasm. Rescuers and rescued were equally overjoyed. On the mountain of Vilna, which the ice rendered impassable, it was necessary to leave the treasure chests of the guard behind. The silver was entrusted to the soldiers who happened to be there at that time. All brought it back intact. Not a penny was missing, and yet all of them were utterly destitute and undergoing the most terrible privations. There was also a well-known story of the little girl of Vilna, whose life the soldiers saved, and whom they adopted and cared for as tenderly as a mother might have done. It is pleasant to recall all these instances of courage and self-sacrifice. Many others, doubtless, will never be known, but I am glad to be able to remind people, by the few incidents just mentioned, that in our day, men still know how to perform deeds of courage and abnegation, and that in the midst of our most serious misfortunes, Frenchmen have always displayed these sterling qualities. Malet's conspiracy was one of the things which had most alarmed the emperor during his absence, and had the most to do in deciding his return to Paris. After people had recovered from the shock of Malet's rash enterprise, they were much amused at the way Monsieur Pasquier, prefect of police, and the Duc de Rovigo had looked when they were dragged off to prison by men who a few hours previously had themselves been behind bars. But the emperor felt that those who should have protected his dynasty had shown a contemptible spirit of vacillation and lack of decision in this affair. He was greatly concerned about it. Meanwhile, enormous plans were underway to make good our losses, and those who had wondered why the emperor had returned to Paris soon learned the reason on the battlefields of Lutzen and Bautzen. as all the officers reappeared in Paris after the vicissitudes they had undergone. I had the great joy of seeing Monsieur de Flahault again. His behavior while in active service had been warmly admired by everyone. In such times of general calamity, a man knows his true colors, displays his qualities and weaknesses, and proves that he is of either less or greatly more than the average value. Since egoism is our strongest trait, the man who sacrifices himself on behalf of others deserves to be honored. Monsieur de Flahault's manservant, who was old and feeble, had remained behind at the attack on the mountain of Vilna. The Cossacks were close at hand. The mountain was crowded with men and slippery with ice. Monsieur de Flahault had already crossed it once with the rest of the emperor's staff when he heard that his servant was in danger of being left behind. He returned over the ground he had just crossed, lifted him on his shoulders, and with great difficulty managed to rejoin the staff and place the valet in a sleigh. Such a spirit of self-sacrifice touched my heart, but did not surprise me on the part of the man who had won my affections. The emperor had frequently sent Monsieur de Flahault on special missions, and being satisfied with the way in which he performed them, appointed him his aide-de-camp. I often met him at court, and therefore found it less gloomy there than it would otherwise have seemed. Is there any place which the presence of the person we love does not make more attractive? The carnival season that year was not very animated, in spite of the balls held as usual in every great capital. My brother's position was a constant source of anxiety to my mother and myself. He had retired to Magdeburg, where he was reorganizing his troops. The entire French cavalry had been practically wiped out in the Russian campaign. My brother was obliged to place himself at the head of his staff to make even the simplest reconnaissance, and he exposed himself as though he were an ordinary private. A Polish colonel named Kliki, when pursued by the Cossacks, owed his life to my brother's presence of mind. Eugène, having shot down the nearest of the colonel's pursuers just as the Cossack was about to fall upon him. It always requires tact to advise a soldier to be careful. To make Eugène give attention to what I had to say, I wrote appropriate verses and sent him good advice set to music. The emperor went to the Trianon for a few days. While there, he had a fall from his horse, which alarmed us greatly and obliged him to remain in bed. He sent for the empress and me to have dinner at his bedside and said to me, well, Hortense, what a great piece of news. It would have been for the English if I had been killed. I was surprised to hear him speak of the English. I had forgotten all about them. But they were the most serious problem of all, and the emperor had them constantly in mind while making his important plans. Our losses had been so great in Russia that I was convinced they would cause the emperor to relinquish his vast undertakings, which formed the real reason for his campaigns, and to whose success many victories had already contributed. I felt sure he would make concessions in order to obtain a much-needed peace, a peace which was as necessary to France as it was to the rest of Europe. Perhaps one more victory was still required to convince the enemy that Russian reverses had not crushed either his force or his genius. But I thought that a peace treaty, even though it were less brilliant than he could have made before the unfortunate campaign, would immediately follow his next military success. Naturally observant and having always been interested in trying to discover in advance what the emperor would do, I was so sure that one more combat would put an end to the hostilities that I definitely ordered the furniture of our room, which I had been wanting for a long time after receiving news of the Battle of Lutzen. Hence, I was entirely sincere in the sentiments I expressed during a conversation I had with the Prince of Schwarzburg, the Austrian ambassador, following the return of the emperor. We never received foreign ambassadors except at our large receptions and in a formal manner. The emperor would not have allowed any intimacy with them. Consequently, I was much surprised when one evening, while I was at home with only my ladies and waiting in attendance, my valet de chambre announced the Prince of Schwarzenberg and Comte de Bubna. De Bubna had just arrived from Vienna, having received a post at the French court. Our servants had by accident allowed the visitors to come upstairs, and they were waiting for me in my drawing room. I could not refuse to see them and greeted them as though I were not aware of the unexpected nature of their visit. I quickly noticed that they had something important to say to me privately. After a few banal remarks, the prince approached me and said in a low voice, "Madame, you who are so familiar with the emperor's character, do you really think we can expect him to make peace? We wish he would do so. Europe is weary, but the emperor, if he wins a victory, will not seek to regain all the former advantages?" I replied that I was convinced that the emperor must score a success in order to restore the confidence of his troops and wipe out the memory of our recent disasters. And I added that I felt so sure the emperor also realized how greatly all of Europe needed rest. He was just as wise an administrator as he was great as a general. To assure the happiness of his subjects was a task worthy of his genius, and one which he never neglected. Up till now, his strength had always lain in the fact that he gave France what she wanted, and if she demanded peace at the present time, he would not stand in the way. Have you not enough influence with him to make him realize that peace is necessary? Asked the prince. He obeys only the commands of public opinion, which become his own wishes, I replied. Then, too, my youth and my position as an obedient daughter have always prevented my offering him any advice. In that case, perhaps Prince Eugène, who rules a great country, who knows what his subjects wish, will speak firmly to the emperor and tell him the entire truth. My brother, more than anyone else, realizes how necessary peace has become. I shall write to him. He will bring up the subject. You may be sure of that, but I repeat, the emperor is too wise to need any advice. One more military victory, and he will devote himself to ensuring the prosperity of his subjects. Monsieur de Bubna repeated about the same things to me as the Prince of Schwarzenberg. I replied to him in these same terms, and when they took their leave, I was firmly convinced that peace was in the hands of Emperor Napoleon, and that he would agree to it. He did intend to do so after having won several battles, but he was doubtless reluctant to make too important sacrifices. Perhaps, too, the enemy's conditions grew more harsh as our forces grew weaker, and theirs consequently became stronger. Monsieur de Flahault, the emperor's aide-de-camp, was sent to the viceroys bearing special messages. He came to see me before he left to inquire if I had any letters to send my brother, and told me the emperor wished to have me mention when I wrote to Eugène how pleased he was at the way in which my brother had behaved. Eugène concentrated his troops. Those of the emperor advanced and joined them at Lutzen, where the famous combat took place which so nobly retrieved our former defeats. At the spot where Gustavus Adolphus had been killed, and near where a monument has been erected to him, Eugène met the emperor. It was here the latter dismounted and embraced him. My brother felt that he had achieved all his desires in thus having taken part in a battle towards whose success his troops had largely contributed, and in having received the expression of everyone's admiration. Before leaving for the front, the emperor had appointed the empress to the post of regent with a council of advisors. We were all present when she took the oath of office. I went to take the waters at Aix-les-Bains. As a result of the constant anxiety we were in regarding the safety of those whom we loved, my health grew steadily worse and demanded care. After all I had gone through, I was only able to keep alive thanks to those healing waters, which every summer helped me to recover a little of my strength and thus be ready to face new trials. I heard of the death of General Duroc, and the news affected me deeply. I had admired his firm, loyal character and his frank outspokenness, even though it at times made him seem positively rude. He was a slave to his duties and scrupulously honest, completely loyal to the interests of his master. He never hesitated to express his personal opinions, and he knew so well the intentions of the emperor that he was frequently able to decide just how far certain orders were to be carried out. He even ventured at times to delay their execution when he felt that they were due to a sudden fit of temper. A king would be more loved if he only had servants like Duroc. Such courtiers deserve to be called friends. The emperor knew this and did everything he could to render the general's last moments less painful, and he sincerely regretted his death. The general's wife, beside possessing the sterling qualities of her husband, was also very charming. Her common sense and healthy point of view made her notable member of the group of young court ladies who enjoyed a well-deserved and favorable reputation. Her friendship and confidence toward me allowed me to judge her merits as they deserved.